Welcome to Mind Architect Lab, Deep Dive. What you are about to hear is a different kind of podcast. Each episode is built on a comprehensive research report, meticulously compiled by our human team. We dive deep into topics to bring you insights you won't find anywhere else. To bring this dense research to life, we use advanced AI-powered voices. This allows us to create in-depth, long-form content for you every week. While this technology is incredible, it isn't always perfect. You may hear an occasional quirk or a slight imperfection in the audio. We believe this is a small trade-off for the quality of the information we can share. And because we value transparency, the complete, detailed research brief this conversation is based on is available to every listener. You'll find the link in the description. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's begin the deep dive.
Mind Architect Lab Deep Dive.
Welcome, architects of the mind, to the Mind Architect Lab. Today, we are deconstructing the dangerous necessity of overcoming the people around you.
That phrase, it really does sound provocative, doesn't it? Almost antisocial when you first hear it.
It does. But as we dug through the sources for today, the meaning became incredibly clear, and it's not what you think.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is, a multidisciplinary look at something many people feel but can't name. The social isolation that is, it seems, inherent in psychological growth, in, consciousness expansion.
Exactly. This isn't a guide on how to, win an argument with your family or be rude to your friends.
Right, not at all.
It's a structural analysis. We're looking at why genuine growth has to create tension with your immediate environment. We found this central thesis woven through all the material.
And that thesis is that the danger of overcoming your environment isn't just, social inconvenience. It's not just a few awkward dinners.
It's so much more than that. The dossier we compiled argues this is a metabolically expensive process.
A neurologically painful one. And, maybe most importantly, a spiritually requisite one. It's what the psychologist Dabrowski called positive disintegration.
Positive disintegration. I love that term. It's the necessary breakdown of the old self so that a higher level self can even begin to emerge.
Think of it like this. You're trying to upgrade your entire internal operating system, but all your social hardware, your friends, your family, your workplace, is still running on the original factory settings.
That's a perfect analogy. And that creates the core conflict we're analyzing today. The tension between your individual authenticity
and the group's need for collective homeostasis, for stability.
And reframing it that way changes everything. The hostility you might face when you start to change. It's not random. It's not just people being mean.
No. It is a systemic defense mechanism. The collective psyche itself is fighting back. The group is literally fighting for its own survival against you, the agent of change.
Which brings us really directly to the foundational text for this entire idea. It's one that gets misunderstood all the time because we romanticize the ending instead of looking at the cost.
Plato's allegory of the cave.
Exactly. Plato's warning.
Which is where we have to start. Part 1. The hostility of the cave and what the sources call the collective immune response.
So most people, when they think of the allegory of the cave, they remember it as this heroic story of enlightenment.
Right. The prisoner breaks free, sees the sun, gets this absolute knowledge.
And then he's supposed to go back and save everyone, right? We focus on the deliverance, but Plato was actually warning of something much darker.
Violence. He was warning of extreme violence.
So why do we misinterpret it so badly? Why do we miss the fate of the returning philosopher?
Because we miss the social system that Plato was describing. The common reading frames the philosopher as a hero, a savior. But Plato is crystal clear. The returning prisoner is seen as an existential threat.
Not a friend, a threat.
He's a wrench in the gears of the cave's reality. He threatens its coherence, its very structure.
The sources we looked at really emphasize this idea that the collective reality, the consensus in the cave, is basically a functional shared hallucination.
It only works because everyone agrees to the terms.
Right. So when one person comes back and says, hey, everyone, those shadows, they're not real.
Yeah.
They're not just offering a new opinion.
No, you're shattering the foundation of the group's stability. From their perspective, that's a direct threat to survival, not just a philosophical disagreement.
And the hostility isn't just emotional. It's structural. It's not about hurt feelings. It's about knowledge and hierarchy.
Yes, and the sources break down the actual mechanisms of that hostility. It's all rooted in the disruption of the cave's, let's call it, internal economy.
The first mechanism being the disruption of prediction. This is fascinating.
Think about it. If your entire life is just watching shadows dance on a wall, what becomes the most valued skill? What gives you status?
Predicting which shadow is going to come next.
Exactly. That's the whole game, the shadow game.
And you see modern versions of this everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. Corporate politics, right. It's all about who can guess what the CEO wants before he does. Or, the whole social media economy of likes and performative outrage. It's all a low complexity prediction game.
So the philosopher returns. He's been blinded by the sun, and now his eyes haven't adjusted to the darkness of the cave again.
He literally can't see the shadows clearly anymore. He can't play the game. He's clumsy. He's disoriented. He's talking about things they can't see.
Like forms and truth. He sounds insane.
And this leads right into the second mechanism, which is invalidation as incompetence. The group doesn't see his fumbling as a gain of insight.
They see it as a loss of capacity.
A severe loss of capacity. In their eyes, the journey didn't enlighten him, it broke him. He's damaged goods, he went outside, and it ruined him.
And they have to see it that way. Because if they admit he gained some higher knowledge, their whole world, their status, their identity collapses.
So they have to label him. Incompetent. Damaged. Crazy. It's a perfect social defense mechanism. It's like a cognitive firewall that protects the entire operating system of the cave.
And this defense is so powerful that it becomes lethal. This is the point Plato drives home, and it's genuinely chilling. The dossier called it the kill reflex of the collective ego.
Plato explicitly says that if the prisoners could get their hands on the one trying to free them, they would kill him.
That's terrifying. It really underscores that we're talking about a systemic immune response, not just social awkwardness.
The collective is static. It's built on rules that are predictable. The returning individual introduces chaos, dynamism. So to the group, the liberator isn't a savior.
He's a destroyer of worlds.
Genuinely. Because their reality model, the shadows, that's their only known safety. It's their template for survival. Anyone who messes with that has to be neutralized.
And you see this play out today. Whistleblowers, dissidents, even just the person in a family who points out the unspoken dysfunction.
The mechanism is always the same. They're neutralized, not based on whether they're right or wrong.
But on their capacity to disrupt the system.
Exactly. And this gets to the heart of what Alan Watts warned about. Humanity has to keep reinterpreting the world. But social conditioning is designed specifically to fight that. The new knowledge you bring back from your journey is often, it's radioactive to the community you left behind.
And this inherent violence, this resistance, it forces us to completely reevaluate the classic archetype of the person who has to walk away.
The figure of the hermit.
Right. We tend to dismiss the hermit as an escapist, a social failure.
But our sources frame it very differently. They see it as a profoundly rational response to the systemic violence of the cave. Strategic retreat.
You can't critique the architecture of a building while you're still inside playing the shadow game. It's impossible. You had to step outside of what the sources call the hermetic loop of social reinforcement.
That withdrawal is what gives you the perspective you need for a genuine appraisal of the system. You stop pouring your energy into a game you now see as false, and you can start channeling that energy inward.
But that separation, even when it's necessary, it causes immediate and immense internal pain.
Yes. Which brings us right into the subjective experience of this split. Let's move into part 2, the ontology of disconnection. What this internal rupture actually feels like.
Okay, so when your internal value system shifts so dramatically, when you go from just watching the shadows to understanding the structure of the cave itself, what happens inside?
The immediate effect is a kind of massive cognitive crash. The sources call this the phenomenology of disconnection. It shows up as this really acute, really isolating form of cognitive dissonance.
Well, we should be clear, we're not talking about a simple disagreement like arguing over politics or something.
No. This is much, much deeper. The term the dossier uses is an ontological shear.
Ontological shear. Okay, break that down for us.
Yeah. Ontology is the study of being, of what's real. So an ontological shear is a difference in the very structure of how you perceive reality itself. You suddenly realize that the foundation your family or your friends are operating on, it's fundamentally different from your new foundation.
Can you use a concrete example? How would that show up in, say, a conversation?
Of course. Let's say you've reached a point where your primary values are philosophical truth and moral authenticity. what Dabrowski would call autonomous values.
Okay.
You go to a family dinner and you realize their entire reality is structured around status acquisition or wealth or, who has the nicest car, socially conditioned values. So when they talk about their life goals, to you, it literally sounds like they're chasing shadows.
Because the metrics they're using to define success now seem completely arbitrary to you.
Completely. Their concerns feel unreal. You're using a new internal blueprint, and they're still using the old one.
Yeah.
And the result is this profound sense of isolation, even when you're in a room full of people you love.
Wow. And that divergence, that sheer, causes a rupture in what Jung called the participation mystique.
Yes, that's the emotional contagion, that unconscious, deep-seated sense of shared identity and belonging that holds a group together. When you stop getting your sense of self and your sense of safety from that shared feeling, you sever the link.
That sounds like falling out of love with your entire social world.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the crushing realization that follows is that the basic social relation you thought you had, this genuine unconditional connection, was actually a transactional performance of roles.
Oof, that's heavy.
It is. You realize you're not actually relating to your brother or your best friend. You're relating to the role of successful professional or agreeable son that they expect you to play.
The authenticity is just gone.
Yeah.
And you're just performing, which then creates this feedback loop of alienation.
Exactly. The sources detail it in 4 stages. Stage 1 is the perceptual shift. That's the private aha moment when you see the truth.
Then comes stage 2, communication failure.
Right. You try to articulate this new reality, and you're met with just blank stares, or denial, or outright hostility.
And this is where language becomes a trap. If everyone in the cave only speaks shadow language, you literally don't have the words to describe the sun.
The language itself is conditioned by the very consensus you're trying to transcend. The failure isn't that you're bad at explaining, it's that the structure for understanding doesn't exist in their world.
Your words, which used to build connection, now signal danger.
Which drives you straight into stage 3, internal conflict. This is the gaslighting phase. You start asking yourself, am I the crazy one? Is this insight even worth all this pain? Maybe I should just shut up and play the game.
And that effort to actively suppress your own authentic self just to keep the peace, that has to be psychologically devastating.
It is, and it's neurologically costly, which we'll get to. But this all culminates in the final stage, structural isolation. The individual finally realizes authentic connection is impossible without faking it.
So the choice becomes, be loved for the mask you no longer wear, or be isolated for the self you're becoming.
And once that choice is made, you become structurally closed to the old tribe. But in doing so, you become structurally open to a new, higher reality. You're forced into a vacuum.
A void. And we're often taught that this void, what Viktor Frankl called the existential vacuum, is a bad thing, a pathology to be filled with noise or distraction.
But the sources insist on a different interpretation. It's not a pathology. It's a prerequisite. They call it the fertile vacuum.
Fertile? Why fertile?
Because it's the only place where what Frankl called the will to meaning can actually be heard clearly. It's the only space quiet enough, free from the noise of social validation and external pressure. It's where you can finally hear your own unmediated purpose.
So the silence is necessary. The void is where you forge new meaning.
It's what transforms that painful feeling of unprotected loneliness into the powerful, generative state of solitude.
Which means this internal rupture, as agonizing as it is actually a necessary part of maturation.
It's framed as an absolute psychological necessity, which brings us to the developmental framework that makes this separation mandatory. Jungian psychology and the death of the persona.
Right. Carl Jung was completely unequivocal about this. He said separation from the collective psyche is the sine qua non.
The absolute essential condition.
For adult maturity, for what he called individuation. The collective is great for security in the first half of life, but it becomes the primary obstacle in the second half.
It's that metaphor of the salmon swimming upstream. The collective is the easy, comfortable downstream current. But real maturity demands that struggle against the current, driven by your inner self.
And the tool the collective uses to keep you in that current is the persona. Let's define that clearly. It's not just your personality.
No, the persona is the mask. It's the mask you wear to satisfy social demands. It's your public identity, your job title, your reputation. And at first, our ego identifies with it completely. We are our job. We are our success.
But then the individuation crisis hits. And the self, the true center of your whole psyche, starts pushing back against that rigid identity.
And because your ego is so fused with the persona, That push from the self feels like a psychological death. It feels like you are suffocating. The identity that the world knows and rewards starts to feel like a lead suit you can't take off.
The sources had a perfect case study for this. A successful executive who, in the middle of a board meeting, just realized, I can't do this anymore. This isn't me. He said, only my persona had a voice, and now it's dead.
That moment is terrifying. It means you have to sacrifice all the safety and status you've built for some unknown potential. But that withdrawal, that feeling, it's not antisocial. It's profoundly pro-authentic.
It's the self saying, I've outgrown this role.
Precisely. But the group does not tolerate that kind of self-determination. When you pull your energy and your validation out of the group structure, they feel that loss immediately, and they fight back.
How? What's the mechanism there?
It's the mobilization of the collective shadow. The collective shadow is all the group's repressed fears, its unlived potential, its shared hypocrisies. The person who starts living authentically
Becomes a mirror.
Exactly. You become a mirror reflecting the group's own inauthenticity back at them. You make the group transparent to its own darkness, and that provokes the same violent hostility that Plato described.
So you're attacked not for your new ideas, but for what your very existence reveals about their limitations.
Yes. It's a defense mechanism to ensure the group doesn't have to confront its own unlived life. And this whole crisis is mapped out beautifully by Kazimierz Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration.
His central idea being that mental health is not the absence of conflict.
Not at all. It's the capacity for development. For Dabrowski, anxiety, inner conflict, depression, these aren't necessarily pathologies. They're often the necessary painful signs of growth. The old, stable structure has to fall apart for a new one to be built.
And the key turning point, which maps perfectly to that ontological shear we talked about, is what he calls level 3, spontaneous multi-level disintegration.
Level 3 is the engine of the whole process. It's when you feel that intense gap between what is your current reality, the shadows, and what ought to be your emerging, authentic personality ideal. That gap creates so much anxiety, it forces the rupture.
And the force that drives you through that gap, that makes you choose the harder path, is the most important concept in his whole theory.
The third factor.
The third factor.
It's the autonomous force of self-determination. It's your free will actively pushing back against your programming. It rejects the first factor, your biology and instincts.
And it rejects the second factor, your social conditioning and group norms.
To choose a unique path based on your own inner values, it's a staggering concept. You are literally fighting your own evolutionary programming that for millions of years has screamed, conformity is survival, dissent is death.
So for Dabrowski, the anxiety and the loneliness you feel during this, they're not a sign you're sick.
They're the growing pains of the third factor, breaking the chains of the collective. The loneliness is the necessary space you need to make your own moral choices without the noise of the cave.
It's a beautiful psychological map. But now we have to get into the hard science of why it's so painful. Why does this feel like a physical illness?
Which brings us to part 4, the neuroscience of pain and expense, and the bioeconomic argument for why we conform.
Okay, the sources here are blunt. From a neurological standpoint, our ancient mammalian brain processes social rupture as a threat on par with a physical injury.
It has to. For almost all of human history, if you were separated from your tribe, you died, period. Your brain hasn't evolved a new special protocol for I'm socially isolating for philosophical growth.
Yeah.
It just has one protocol, threat, mortal danger.
And we can see this on brain scans. This isn't a metaphor. The pain overlap theory shows that social pain is literally physically painful.
Yes, fMRI studies are definitive on this. When people experience social rejection like, say, looking at a photo of an ex who dumped them, or being excluded from a simple online game.
It's just a game.
Even a simple game. 2 specific brain regions consistently light up. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, DACC, and the anterior insula.
And crucially, those are the exact same regions that process the distressing emotional component of physical pain.
It's not the sharp sensation of, say, a cut, but it's the anguish, the ow, something is very, very wrong part of pain.
So when that executive felt like his persona was dead and it was agonizing, his brain was literally registering that social death with the same circuitry it would use for a broken bone.
It's a brutally efficient evolutionary design. The system ensures you conform by making nonconformity physically agonizing.
Okay, so that's the pain of dissent. What about the other side? The neurochemistry of fitting in.
Conformity is chemically rewarding. When you agree with the group, when you feel that sense of belonging and safety, your ventral striatum activates.
Which gives you a little hit of dopamine.
A palpable dopaminergic hit of, you're safe, you fit in, you survive. But the second you dissent, your brain doesn't just withhold the reward. It screams an error signal.
An error signal?
Yes. When your opinion or behavior doesn't match the tribe's, it triggers a prediction error signal in the posterior medial frontal cortex, PMFC, and the rostral cingulate zone, RCZ. Think of it like your brain's internal GPS. If you take a turn it wasn't expecting, it immediately shouts, error, recalculating.
It flags the mismatch as a problem that needs to be corrected urgently. It's trying to pull you back into line.
And to fight that powerful urge to sustain that nonconforming stance, to use Dabrowski's third factor, you need your lateral prefrontal cortex to exert constant, heavy, top-down inhibition.
And that is where the exhaustion comes from. This is the metabolic cost of authenticity.
Absolutely. This is the bioeconomic argument for staying in the cave. Your brain is a resource hog. It's 2% of your body weight, but uses 20% of your energy, mostly glucose.
So it's optimized for conservation.
Above all else.
Yeah.
And conformity is the greatest energy-saving hack it has. It relates to the free energy principle. The brain's job is to minimize surprise and uncertainty.
If I know what the tribe expects, I don't have to calculate every single social interaction from scratch.
Exactly. The social reality of the cave, the rules, the customs, the assumptions, it serves as a massive, efficient external memory drive of predictions. By conforming, you outsource your computation. You don't have to think, you just run the script. It saves incredible amounts of energy.
But individuation forces you to throw that script away. You have to start coding reality from scratch, constantly.
And that fatigue you feel when you're going through this, it's not in your head. It is a literal, measurable depletion of glucose in your prefrontal cortex. The cost of running the third factor is physically real.
And this chronic fight against your environment, this constant internal conflict, creates a state of high allostatic load.
Which is the medical term for the wear and tear on your body from chronic stress. Your brain is constantly fighting contradictory data, which leads to physical burnout. It's why that solitary withdrawal, that need for hermit's cave, becomes a biological necessity. You're literally running out of fuel.
So, to synthesize all this data, the hostility of the tribe isn't just psychological, it's fundamentally biological. A non-conforming person increases the entropy, the energy cost, of the whole system.
Leaving the cave is basically declaring war on the thermodynamic laws governing the group's social brain. It's the ultimate structural challenge.
And because that challenge activates the same pathways as physical agony, it can often look and feel like a clinical pathology.
Which is why we need to make a critical distinction. This brings us to part 5, telling the difference between a dark night of the soul and clinical depression to avoid pathologizing a necessary developmental crisis.
This is so important because the subjective feelings, the sadness, the isolation, the fatigue, they can feel identical.
They can, but their teleology, their purpose, their trajectory is completely different. We wanted to give you a kind of framework to assess your own inner experience.
We can start with the concept itself. The dark night of the soul comes from St. John of the Cross, and he didn't see it as a disease. He saw it as a purgative process.
A process where the spirit is stripped of its attachment to sensory and social rewards. All the things we use to feel good that aren't, reality itself.
Okay, so let's walk through the key differences, almost like a checklist. First up, root cause.
Clinical depression often has roots in, say, chemical imbalances, trauma, or ingrained maladaptive thought patterns. The dark night is a spiritual or developmental crisis. It's a necessary detachment from old rewards to foster a deeper authenticity.
Next, and this one is crucial, the view of self.
In clinical depression, self-loathing is often central. I am bad. I am worthless. I am broken. In the dark night, there's often a deep sense of unworthiness, but it's in relation to a higher ideal, to the absolute, or to your potential self. The core self isn't seen as fundamentally broken.
The pain is purgative, aimed at improvement, not destructive, aimed at self-elimination.
That is the vital distinction, which leads directly to the capacity to function. Clinical depression often brings with it a profound paralysis, an apathy that makes daily tasks impossible.
But the dark night is often characterized by what the sources call functional suffering.
Yes, your vitality for your duties, for your work, for caring for your family, that often remains intact. Even though you feel an intense inner dryness or aridity, you keep going, but you get no emotional reward for it.
Suffering without paralysis, that's a key distinction. What about connection to other people?
This one is very telling. The isolation of depression often breeds resentment and a kind of victimhood. The focus is entirely on your own pain.
Whereas the isolation of a spiritual crisis can actually increase compassion.
Right. Because you understand your personal pain as just one part of the universal human condition. You feel separate from your immediate group, but more connected to humanity as a whole.
Okay, and finally, productivity and humor.
Clinical depression often kills your sense of humor, your ability to see irony. But in the dark night, humor and complex productivity are often preserved. There's a capacity for what Keats called negative capability, being able to exist in uncertainty without that irritable need for answers.
And that spiritual aridity, that lack of reward, is actually the whole point.
It is. The dryness is the feeling of being weaned off the sugar of social approval. Your spirit is learning to love reality for its own sake, not just for the rewards it gives you. You stop treating the people around you as sources of validation,
Which the ego experiences as a terrible loneliness.
but the spirit experiences as radical freedom.
This purification of the will. It's the exact transition Dabrowski mapped. Moving from a heteronymous will governed by external rules and fear to an autonomous will governed by your inner truth. The third factor.
And the person who endures this, who uses that solitude and negative capability to manage the metabolic and psychological costs, they don't just survive. They transform from being a passive reflection of their environment to an active architect of their reality.
This has been a difficult, but I think a very necessary diagnosis. We've mapped the philosophy, the psychology, and the biology of this agonizing process.
Yes. The person who is overcoming the people around them isn't being aggressive. They are simply choosing to pay the massive energy cost required for radical authenticity. We've established that the phenomenology of disconnection, the persona death, the cognitive dissonance, the dark night, is the feeling of the third factor awakening.
It's the fertile vacuum you need for the true self to emerge. And the goal, ultimately, isn't permanent isolation. It's to gain the capacity to return to the world with an authentic consciousness, no longer pulled around by the current. To overcome others is really just to finally be able to offer them the only thing of value you truly have, a free self.
We have diagnosed the problem and mapped the structure of this agonizing separation. We know why the cave fights back and why your brain screams in pain, but the analysis is not complete. In our next segment, we will shift our focus to the architecture of the return, how to build the structures necessary to survive this disintegration and emerge as a sovereign individual. Continuing our analysis in the lab, we've just examined the neurobiological and social violence of separation, that painful rupture from the collective homeostasis. Now, let's move to the critical next phase, the reconstruction of the self through the engine of positive disintegration.
This is such a critical pivot point, isn't it? We're moving from just looking at the pain, just diagnosing the chronic pain of, social rupture. And we start actually utilizing that isolation, that existential anxiety as the necessary fuel.
The engine.
It's the engine for achieving a higher order consciousness. So our mission in this deep dive is, I think, really crucial. It's to provide you, the learner, with a comprehensive, actionable guide for surviving what our research dossier explicitly calls it's a metabolically expensive, neurologically painful, and spiritually requisite process.
Exactly. Every one of those words matters. Metabolically expensive, neurologically painful. We're looking at the architectural blueprints for how you build an authentic, self-determined self after you've consciously stepped out of the security of what Plato called the cave.
And the sources we're pulling from here are so rich.
Oh, they're fantastic.
We aren't just looking at one discipline. This is a dossier that integrates, the depth psychology of Jung, the incredible developmental maps of Kazimierz Dabrowski.
The existential analysis of Viktor Frankl, which is just so vital here.
And all of it is grounded in cutting-edge social neuroscience. So we get this really holistic picture of what growth actually looks and feels like.
So if you're listening to this and you're feeling that intense cognitive dissonance, that sense of severe alienation from your environment, or an inner conflict that just feels paralyzing, this deep dive is your reframe. We're going to show you why those symptoms aren't defects that you need to eliminate. They're necessary developmental indicators. This is the shortcut to understanding the precise architecture of return.
I love that. The architecture of return. Let's get into it.
Let's start with the foundation, the concept that just flips the entire script on mental health. Kazimierz Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, or TPD.
And right away, this theory just comes in and challenges the conventional view of mental health that, let's be honest, almost everyone operates under.
And what is that view?
Well, that conventional view is so simple, and that's what makes it dangerous. It's just health is the absence of symptoms.
Right.
If you're not overtly anxious, if you're not depressed, not highly conflicted, then you're seen as functional, you're stable, you're healthy.
But Dabrowski, he was studying these incredibly creative, often very troubled minds of his time, and he just fundamentally rejected that idea.
Completely.
The source argues that true mental health is not the absence of psychological distress. It is the capacity for development towards a higher, self-chosen value hierarchy.
It's such a radical reframe.
It is.
Yeah.
Because what we normally label as pathology, the anxiety, the inner conflicts, the so-called psychoneuroses, Dabrowski identifies them as necessary, as functional.
He calls them the engines of development.
The engines of development.
Let's just pause on that image for a second. An engine. We think of mental symptoms as signs that a machine is breaking down.
Right, that something is wrong.
But Dabrowski is saying, no, that's the sound of a new, higher-powered engine being installed, and it's causing the old structure to vibrate violently.
So if you suppress the anxiety,
You're suppressing the developmental engine. If you stay rigidly in what he calls level I primary integration, you might be outwardly conflict-free, you might be compliant, but you are developmentally arrested. You're just living by biology and social consensus.
which leads us right into his hierarchy of development. So level I, primary integration, that's the baseline state. This is the conformist, the rigid conflict-free state, the perfect cave dweller, to use Plato's analogy.
There's a total unconscious identification with the group's norms, with your biological impulses, with whatever you were socialized to be.
And crucially, there's no inner conflict.
None. Because your internal architecture perfectly mirrors and accepts the external consensus. There's nothing to fight against.
But then the crisis hits.
Yeah.
Positive crisis.
Yes.
This is when the individual hits level 3, spontaneous multi-level disintegration. This is the turning point. This is the rupture.
And it feels awful. It's marked by this intense existential anxiety and, most importantly, this clear, agonizing perception of what is versus the potential for what ought to be.
That's the gap.
That's the gap. And that internal ethical distinction, that's what marks the individual's rupture with their environment. They see the shadows on the cave wall and realize they're just projections.
And everyone else still believes they're real.
They believe it's the only reality.
So what's so fascinating is, why do some people stay happily integrated at level I while others are just structurally incapable of it? They're destined to hit that violent rupture point.
This is where Dabrowski introduces a really crucial biological and genetic component.
The overexcitabilities? OEs.
Exactly. Overexcitability. They're the raw, intense processing capacity of the person.
And the research dossier is really emphatic about this. It says they are genetic traits that predispose you to disintegration.
They're not disorders.
No, not at all. They are traits of high-frequency processing, cognitive, emotional, sensory, but they cause severe friction within a level I environment, which is optimized for, low-frequency processing and consensus.
The analogy in the source is so powerful. The individual with high OEs vibrates at a different frequency.
That's a perfect way to put it.
They process data sensory, intellectual, emotional ADEF with so much more intensity and depth and complexity than the average person in the cave.
And that very processing efficiency is what makes them feel so maladjusted. They can't help but notice the contradictions that the level I person just blissfully ignores.
So we have to detail the 5 types because they are the root cause of this existential friction.
Okay, let's break them down.
The first is intellectual overexcitability.
Right, and this is that nonstop probative questioning.
Yeah.
The theoretical thirst, the need to understand the architecture of reality, not just accept the facade.
Oh, exactly. Just imagine this person in a bureaucratic meeting where the logic is circular or the policies are hypocritical.
I can't let it go.
They physically can't. And that refusal to just accept the unspoken assumptions, well, it leads to an inevitable clash with systems that are built on simple conformity.
Okay, so that's intellectual. What's next?
Next is emotional overexcitability.
And this goes way beyond just being sensitive.
So much further. It involves these intense, complex feelings, deep attachments, and this is critical, what Dabrowski calls the somatic memory of emotion.
Meaning their body literally holds on to the experience?
Yes, their body retains the trauma or the joy or the pain of past emotional events with a physical intensity. It makes all their experiences profoundly vivid.
So the required superficiality, the emotional flatness of a level I's environment.
It becomes physically and emotionally unbearable. It drives them toward either deeper connections or, very often, painful isolation.
Okay, I see that. What's the third one?
Imaginational overexcitability. And this one is maybe the most essential driver of the level 3 rupture.
Why is that?
Because this is the vivid, almost cinematic internal imagery. It's metaphorical thinking. It's the ability to project and imagine radically different, better realities.
Oh, so if you can vividly construct and almost live within the reality of what ought to be,
Then the reality of what is the caveat becomes intolerable. That's the source of that painful gap that Dabrowski talks about.
right. Okay, so we have intellectual, emotional, imaginational. There are two more.
Yes. The other two contribute heavily to that daily sense of exhaustion and misalignment. So psychomotor overexcitability.
This is excess nervous energy, rapid speech, constant movement, impulsivity.
Yes. And in a school or an office, what do we call that?
We pathologize it. We call it hyperactivity.
Of course. But here, it's understood as this raw nervous energy that just cannot be contained by the rigid, sedentary, compliant structure of level 1. The person's physically vibrating out of sync with their environment.
And the last one.
Finally, sensual overexcitability, a heightened sensory experience.
This isn't just a preference like I don't like wool sweaters.
No, it's a biological imperative for comfort or an extreme repulsion by abrasive stimuli, certain sounds, textures, lights.
I can see that. So if the sensory environment of the cave is abrasive, harsh fluorescent lights, loud chatter, cheap materials.
The high OE individual is forced into physical and psychological withdrawal. So these 5 OEs, often in combination, they basically ensure that an individual is structurally predisposed to level 3 disintegration.
And this high-frequency friction, it doesn't just create anxiety. It actually catalyzes these internal forces. The dynamisms of separation, as the source calls them. They actively break the chains.
Yes, and the first and most critical dynamism is what he calls the subject-object in oneself.
The genesis of consciousness.
That's what it is. It's the critical splitting of the self into an observing factor and an acting factor.
Give me an example of that.
You might be sitting at a family gathering or a mandatory corporate dinner, and you're watching yourself participate in the social ritual. You're saying the words, making the gestures, and suddenly, almost violently, you realize the person doing that behavior is not me.
That's a huge moment.
It's everything. That capacity to observe your own mental life and behavior as an object, something that can be judged against your higher values, that's the prerequisite for all autonomy.
And it's intensely painful, I'd imagine.
Terribly. But it's necessary.
Yeah.
Because it allows for the rise of the second dynamism, the third factor.
So what is the third factor?
It's the crucial, active, autonomous force of self-determination. It is the conscious will that steps into that split you just created.
And it chooses.
It chooses. It rejects two immensely powerful and ancient forces. The first factor, which is your biology, your raw impulses, your drive for survival.
And the second factor, which is society. Socialization, the massive pressure for reward and conformity.
And the third factor rejects both of them to choose its own higher internal path.
Okay, but we have to challenge the material here a little bit.
Crazy.
Because that sounds dangerously close to just intellectual arrogance, doesn't it? If the third factor is just your will pushing against biology and society, how do we distinguish Dabrowski's concept from, simple high-T behavior or narcissism?
That's a really valid challenge. And the distinction lies entirely in the third dynamism, the hierarchization of values.
Oh, okay.
If the third factor is simply choosing an alternative path, being a rebel for the sake of being a rebel, that's still level I or 2.
It's just a different kind of conformity.
Exactly. True Dabrowski level 3 development means the individual develops a fully articulated, personal, ethical ladder. It has to be consciously chosen and has to aim toward a higher moral baseline.
So the humanization only begins when the individual commits to that hierarchy.
And when that internal ethically driven hierarchy inevitably conflicts with the external social hierarchy, and it will conflict, the individual must choose the internal one to maintain their sanity.
So the third factor is the executive function that enforces that choice.
That's it. It's the defining, painful moment of separation. Because choosing the internal means giving up the external.
And that pain isn't just social, is it? It's the existential weight of knowing you are now responsible for building your own values without the convenience of external guidance.
And that pain is the perfect transition to where we need to go next.
Now that we've framed the developmental mechanism, we have to address the intense suffering that comes with this disintegration.
This is the stage where a person is most vulnerable to being misunderstood, isn't it? Because their profound inner struggle It looks a lot like clinical pathology from the outside.
It does. And misidentifying this boundary, it can lead to pathologizing what is actually necessary existential suffering, which can derail the entire process of growth.
So the moment the persona dies, that social mass that connected you to the tribe, a massive void is created.
A vacuum. A vacuum. And here we move from Dabrowski's structural crisis to Viktor Frankl's existential analysis. He calls this painful, terrifying emptiness the existential vacuum.
And society hates a vacuum.
Hates it.
The source notes that the collective system sees this emptiness as a defect, a gap that has to be filled immediately with noise.
Consumerism, endless chatter, hyperactivity, social media validation.
Anything. The collective can't tolerate the silence because silence implies a lack of control, a lack of conformity.
But Frankl sees it with such incredible hope. He calls it a fertile vacuum.
Fertile? Why fertile?
Because this void, this silence, is the only necessary precondition where your authentic will to meaning can actually be heard. The vacuum is the absolute silence you need after the loud, incessant demands of the second factor of society have finally been muted. The isolation removes the noise that distracts you from finding your unique purpose.
And that purpose is what's going to sustain your new value hierarchy. This realization, then, allows us to make that systematic comparison from the source, the crucial distinctions between clinical depression and what's called the spiritual dark night of the soul.
The key difference isn't the feeling, the intensity of the suffering, it's the teleology.
The purpose or the trajectory of the suffering.
Exactly. So let's break down these markers, starting with the view of self. In clinical depression, the suffering involves deep self-loathing, feelings of worthlessness. The core belief is I am defective, I am bad, I am broken.
The self is the problem.
A self is the pathological problem.
But the dark night, on the other hand, involves a profound sense of unworthiness. But it's specifically in relation to the absolute or to the high standards set by that emerging personality ideal of level 4 or V.
So the self is still intact?
Intact and actually undergoing intense purification. It's seeing its own flaws, but only in contrast to the perfect ideal it's striving for. The pain isn't I am broken, it's I am falling short.
Okay, that's a huge distinction. What about functionality?
Clinical depression often results in apathy, anhedonia, severe disability, a complete halting of productivity, and a withdrawal from life. The pain is paralyzing.
But the dark night, it often allows for what the source calls functional suffering.
Right, like the example of Mother Teresa.
It's a powerful example. She experienced decades of profound inner darkness, but maintained her mission, her productivity, the vitality for your duty, your work, that commitment to the third factor. It remains, even if the inner emotional or spiritual feeling is completely gone.
The commitment to the act, not the feeling of the act.
Precisely. Okay, third distinction, the goal of pain.
A clinically depressed person sees the pain as an error, a mistake, a defect to be eliminated immediately by any means necessary. The goal is just relief.
But in the dark night, the suffering is marked by this existential willingness to endure the pain if it yields meaning or ethical insight or purifies your character.
The suffering itself is seen as meaningful, a necessary consequence of growth. The person choosing this path understands that easy comfort would just send them right back to level 1.
Okay, and the final distinction is maybe the most powerful. It's the emotional state. Specifically, what mystics called spiritual aridity or dryness.
This is the withdrawal of the emotional sugar.
The dopamine hits of social approval, the spiritual consolations, the good feelings you get from doing good work, all of it. Gone.
And this is the purification of the will itself.
How so?
Well, the developmental purpose is to force the individual to love reality, the raw, unvarnished truth of their chosen values, and not just the rewards of reality.
So you move from being attached to the good, validating feelings of the tribe
to an authentic, resilient commitment to the value itself, to the third factor, even when that commitment gives you no emotional pleasure at all.
We have to underscore how important this is.
Yeah.
If you're experiencing a state of aridity, that deep sense of meaninglessness, but you still have the capacity to function and pursue your duty, you are likely in a developmental crisis, not a pathological one.
And if that struggle is pathologized as just a chemical imbalance, the individual gets pushed back into the cave, medicated against the very signal of their own growth.
Understanding that your profound struggle has a teleology, a purpose, is the first step in surviving it. But surviving the immense neurological and metabolic cost of level 3 requires some very specific training.
It really does. So this developmental crisis, it's triggered by the friction of those overexcitabilities, and it's enforced by the third factor, and it is immensely painful. As the neuroscience confirmed, it registers as social exclusion, which activates physical pain centers in the brain.
It literally hurts.
It literally hurts.
Yeah.
So we turn now to the psychological tool you need for survival, building negative capability.
This is a concept that gets quoted a lot, but I don't think it's often truly internalized. It comes from the Romantic poet John Keats, way back in 1817.
And he defined it as the necessary capacity to exist in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason.
Irritable reaching. That phrase is everything.
It's key.
Let's connect that directly back to the neurological cost. Why is the reaching irritable? Because the brain, governed by the free energy principle, is an optimization machine. It's designed to minimize surprise and uncertainty because that minimizes metabolic cost.
Uncertainty is high computation. It's expensive.
Exactly. So the irritable reaching is the brain's immediate panic response. It's the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC, the pain center screaming for cognitive closure because certainty is metabolically cheap.
And negative capability is the prefrontal muscle that suppresses that panic response. It's the active choice to tolerate ambiguity and that high computational load.
So it's the internal exertion of the third factor on a neurological level.
That's a great way to put it.
You are consciously overriding the ancient, efficient mechanism designed to keep you safe through quick conformity and low-energy decisions. You are choosing the painful truth over the comforting, cheap certainty.
And psychoanalysis, particularly through Wilfred Bion, adapted this concept. He clarified that negative capability is not stoic detachment. It's not passivity.
It's an active state.
It's a very active state. It's the ability to tolerate the pain and confusion of not knowing the outcome, resisting the urge to just impose a false ready-made certainty or frantically run back to the old comfortable persona. It means you resist the urge to prematurely label the tension as fixed or solved.
But what are the common pitfalls here? Someone listening is in that state of profound alienation and uncertainty at level 3. How do they know if they're practicing negative capability versus just, learned helplessness or passive surrender?
That's the intellectual friction we need. The distinction is all in the intention. Passive surrender is a collapse of the third factor. It's resignation.
Okay.
Negative capability, on the other hand, is an act of courageous maintenance.
Yeah.
You are holding that space open intentionally because you know the immediate answer will be a lie. It'll be a level I consensus answer. You're tolerating the pain of the DACC for a higher purpose.
Okay, so how do we practice this? What are the actionable steps for building this kind of inhibitory control in the prefrontal cortex?
The first essential step is to identify the circle of control. This takes real cognitive discipline.
You have to distinguish what you can influence versus what you can't.
Exactly. You have to draw a line between the small island of things you can influence, your choices, your reaction to the pain, your commitment to your internal hierarchy, and the massive ocean of uncertainty you can't.
Like what the cave dwellers think, or the speed of social change.
Or when or if emotional consolation will return. Focusing your very limited energy only on the controllable elements, it just reduces the generalized panic.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second step?
The second is proactive openness. When that comfortable level I persona dies, the brain is screaming for you to retreat back to the safety of the old known structures, to reintegrate cheaply.
So this skill requires you to consciously remain in that liminal space.
Yes, that uncomfortable transition period between the old self and the new one. You have to resist rushing back to the predictable conformity of the old identity. You are actively choosing to stay on that uncomfortable threshold.
And the final one sounds like the hardest.
It is, the suspension of judgment. When that inevitable anxiety of disconnection, that DACC pain arises, that feeling of social inadequacy or existential dread, the practice is to hold the tension.
Don't label it.
Do not immediately label it as wrong or bad or rush to soothe it with distractions or quick fixes. You have to observe the pain of the uncertainty with curiosity.
And doing that over and over again.
This repeated exercise strengthens the prefrontal cortex's ability to exert inhibitory control. It overrides those ancient emotional reflexes triggered by social pain. It's the art of sitting in discomfort with analytical curiosity instead of panic.
But that sounds like a marathon exercise. If individuation requires this constant high-level inhibitory control, it has to be draining an immense amount of energy.
It is. And that leads us perfectly into the second protocol, which addresses the very real physical consequences of this marathon.
Right. So while Protocol A, negative capability, addresses the mental muscle of tolerance,
The psychological survival skill?
Protocol B addresses the sheer physical metabolic cost of maintaining that stance. We have to keep coming back to the neuroscience context. The brain is optimized to conserve glucose. It uses about 20% of the body's energy, and it wants efficiency above all else.
This is what the source calls the bioeconomic cost of authenticity.
Explain that.
Conformity is incredibly cheap metabolically. The collective social reality, it acts like a massive external predictive coding engine. It lets the brain outsource prediction and decision-making.
So when everyone agrees on the shadows on the wall,
Your individual brain doesn't have to waste energy predicting reality. It just matches the consensus. This minimizes what's called free energy, or surprise.
and that's the key. Individuation, that choice made by the third factor, is structurally expensive. Acting out of character, which really means acting authentically in a conforming environment, it requires the brain to abandon all those efficient shared heuristics.
It forces the brain into high computation prediction. You have to continuously simulate the gap between the external consensus and your internal value hierarchy. And that incurs a literal, measurable, and continuous metabolic cost.
So when a person going through this feels that profound chronic exhaustion, the kind that sleep doesn't fix, it's not a moral failure. It's not laziness.
No. The exhaustion is literal. It's observable depletion. The source confirms this. It's a measurable depletion of glucose and something called astrocyte-derived lactate, specifically in the prefrontal cortex.
The exact region required for top-down inhibitory control.
And maintaining high values and resisting the urge to conform, it's all happening there.
And on top of that, maintaining a complex, non-conforming value system in contradiction to your social environment that places the organism under chronic allostatic load.
You're constantly predicting, resisting, filtering incoming social data that contradicts your internal model.
And that chronic stress, it weakens those prefrontal networks over time. It forces the brain to recruit broader, less efficient networks just to maintain baseline control.
This is precisely why the stress of overcoming the people around you so often leads to physical burnout and a compromised immune system. The danger is biological, not just sociological.
The tribe tries to pull the individual back, not just for social cohesion, but because a non-conforming unit increases the entropy and the energy cost of the whole group system.
So the resistance you feel is the system trying to normalize its energy expenditure.
Given this non-negotiable metabolic cost, then, the individual needs a structural, scheduled countermeasure. And this is where we introduce the concept of restorative niches from Professor Brian Little's work.
Because since interacting with the cave forces a high-cost performance acting out of character, performing the persona a restorative niche is a dedicated physical or temporal space designed specifically for neurophysiological recovery.
This is much more than just taking a break.
It's systematic glucose management. If a high OE individual has to perform the high-cost role of an extrovert or conform to a rigid schedule, they must have a guaranteed recovery period right after to let the brain switch back to its low-computation internal baseline.
And this recovery, it needs to be formalized, non-negotiable. What Little calls the free trait agreement.
It's the necessity of scheduling solitude to manage your metabolic cost. For someone with high intellectual or emotional OEs, for instance, attending a mandatory networking event or a family dinner where you have to suppress your real thoughts, that's a high-cost performance.
So the free treat agreement is the specific deal you make with yourself.
And with others, if you can. I will perform the social role, acting out of character to fulfill a necessary duty for X hours, provided I get Y hours of absolute solitude, my restorative niche immediately afterward.
You're explicitly recognizing that the expenditure requires a defined, scheduled compensation.
Let's get practical. For the person with high intellectual OE who has to sit through a 4-hour, unproductive, circular corporate meeting, a massive drain because they have to suppress all their probative questions.
Their restorative niche might be an hour alone in a quiet room with advanced theoretical physics texts or complex music.
Right. Their brain recovers by operating at its preferred high computation baseline, free from external contradiction.
Okay, and for the person with high emotional OE who just spent 2 hours navigating a complex, emotionally charged family dynamic, absorbing and processing the somatic memory of everyone's unspoken feelings.
Their niche has to be almost immediately accessible. That might be a specific type of meditation, or just 45 minutes of lying flat in absolute silence and darkness, letting the nervous system deregulate without any more sensory input from others.
So these niches can be places, a library, a garden, a specific chair, or they can be practices.
Playing music, rigorous physical exercise, solo creative writing, anything that lets the brain operate at its authentic internal frequency without the constant high-energy load of conforming prediction and inhibitory control.
It's an ecological solution to a neurological problem.
It is, and if you fail to implement Protocol B, the cost of Protocol A of negative capability will eventually bankrupt your body and force a pathological collapse.
Yeah.
You can't sustain level 3 individuation without managing the glucose.
Okay, so we've navigated the separation of level 3, and we've detailed the survival tools in protocols A and B. But staying in that isolated state for too long, it carries its own subtle psychological danger.
Yes. The trap of narcissistic rumination.
Explain that.
If the individual just continuously cycles through questions focused on self-pity, why am I alone, why don't they understand me, they fall into what Frankl called hyper-reflection.
This focus on the self.
It reinforces the very pain pathways they're trying to overcome. The hyperactivity in the default mode network, which just loops the rejection event, and the DAC scintilla pain centers. The suffering becomes circular, unproductive, and, well, essentially narcissistic.
And the solution, according to Frankl, is an active shift of focus, dereflection and self-transcendence.
The pivot here is not subtle at all. It is a full 180-degree shift of energy away from the self and toward meaning or toward the other.
And the technique is so profound in its simplicity. Instead of asking, what do I expect from life?
Which is a question rooted in egocentric demand.
You ask, what does life expect from me?
And this directs all that immense energy and conflict of the third factor toward a value that's higher than the self. It bypasses the toxic feedback loop of social rejection and self-pity. You're using your new autonomy to serve your chosen personality ideal.
So when the individual successfully navigates the disintegration, embraces the purification of the dark night, and commits to this self-transcendence, they reach Dabrowski's final stage.
Secondary integration, level V.
And this is not a return to level I. It's not conformity.
No, it's the establishment of harmony without conformity. The self is fully integrated, built on that autonomous hierarchy of values, and most importantly, it's ready to return to the world.
And this defines the architecture of that return, the Bodhisattva philosopher king model, as Plato foreshadowed. The individual returns to the cave, but is structurally, psychologically, and morally impervious to its lower frequency.
The crucial understanding here is what the source calls the post-isolation stance.
The return is not to convert the cave dwellers.
No. If you go back in shouting, "You're all wrong, follow my light," you invite the precise hostility Plato warned of. The collective will try to kill the liberator because he disrupts their entire reality model.
So the return is simply to exist, to be an authentic, high-frequency example.
But that sounds deeply lonely, to see the shadow play, to commit to not participating, but also not to convert. How does one keep that radical detachment from turning into just cynical superiority?
That's the ultimate test of secondary integration. And the mechanism that makes it possible is dual processing.
Okay, what does that mean?
The level V individual has the ability to hold their own autonomous hierarchy of values as absolute truth for themselves, while simultaneously acknowledging and understanding the function of the group's hierarchy without needing to reconcile them. They maintain their internal integrity without judging the necessity of the group's illusion for the group members.
So they can look at the shadow play of the cave, understand why it's there, recognize the humanity of the people trapped there, but refuse to engage in the game.
Exactly. They are, as the source suggests, structurally closed to group influence. Their third factor protects their internal architecture, but they remain structurally open to the group's basic humanity and suffering.
They're in the world, but entirely distinct from it.
The necessity of overcoming the people around you is revealed as the high cost of attaining a free and authentic consciousness. And that consciousness, once it's integrated and purified through the dark night, is the only thing of intrinsic sustainable value that the individual has to offer to the world upon their return.
It's the boon from the hero's journey, and it has to be vigilantly kept untarnished by the low-frequency demands of the collective.
The entire trajectory, then, from that violent rupture driven by overexcitabilities through the disciplined endurance of negative capability and restorative niches, culminates in level V.
A return marked by compassion, functional detachment, and an unbreakable internal structure built on self-chosen values.
We started this deep dive by noting that the brain interprets individuation as a mortal threat, equivalent to physical injury. The sheer existence of an autonomous consciousness is a biological declaration of war on the laws of thermodynamics that govern the social brain. It fights the principle of low metabolic cost. So, now that you know the biological cost of autonomy, the glucose depletion, the allostatic load, the DACC pain, how must you fundamentally restructure your life, your schedule, and your relationships to allow your consciousness to evolve?
A fascinating dissection of the human condition and the architecture of a self-determined life. To continue building your arsenal of knowledge, please subscribe to our channel, Mind Architect Lab, on YouTube. And to access the full research report used for this episode, check the link in the description. Until next time.